The snow had stopped falling 3 hours ago, but the cold had not relented. She stood at the edge of a frozen ridge, 8,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the Pyrenees. The year was 1942, November. The wind cut through wool and leather like neither existed. Below her, the valley dropped into darkness. Above, the peaks dissolved into a gray nothing that promised more snow before dawn. Her left leg was not a leg. It was aluminum and wood, strapped to what remained of her limb just below the knee. She had named it Cuthbert years ago, a private joke that had long since stopped being funny. Tonight, Cuthbert was a traitor. The socket had rubbed her stump raw during the first day of climbing. By the second day, the skin had cracked. Now, on the third night, she could feel warmth inside her boot that should not have been there. Blood. Infection would follow if she could not clean and dress it soon. But there was no soon. There was only the next step. Behind her, somewhere in the foothills she had left 2 days ago, German intelligence services were circulating her description to every checkpoint, every border post, every collaborator who might recognize a woman who walked with a distinctive limp. The Gestapo had given her a name she never asked for, the Limping Lady. They considered her the most dangerous Allied spy in France. She did not feel dangerous now. She felt cold. She felt slow. She felt the weight of every decision that had led her to this ridge, this night, this impossible crossing. The guide had warned her before they set out from the safe house. The route would take 4 days in good weather. They did not have good weather. They had ice. They had wind. They had German patrols on the French side and Spanish border guards on the other, and neither would show mercy to a woman traveling without papers through restricted mountain passes in wartime. There were others with her, a handful of men, also fleeing, but they had moved faster. They had 2 legs each. They had disappeared into the darkness ahead, and she had not seen their shapes against the snow for over an hour. She was alone now. Ahead, the trail, if it could be called a trail, narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for her shoulders. The drop to the left was invisible in the dark, but she knew it was there. She had felt the wind rising from it. One misstep on the ice and she would not have to worry about the Gestapo or the cold or the infection spreading through her stump. The problem with one misstep was that she took twice as many as anyone else. Cuthbert did not flex. Cuthbert did not adjust. Cuthbert transmitted every angle of the terrain directly into the raw tissue of her residual limb, and every transmission was a message in a language made entirely of pain. She moved forward anyway. There was no alternative. France was behind her. The networks she had spent 18 months building were collapsing. The Nazis had invaded the southern zone, erasing the last illusion of unoccupied territory. Her cover, already thin, had evaporated entirely. Every contact, every safe house, every courier route she had memorized was now compromised or soon would be. And still they were hunting her. The Limping Lady. As if the limp were the sum of her. As if the leg were all she was. She reached the ledge and pressed her back against the rock face. The wind screamed through the gap in the peaks. She could not feel her fingers inside her gloves. She could not feel her good foot inside its boot. The only sensation that remained clear was the hot pulse of damaged tissue where Cuthbert met flesh. Somewhere ahead, the Spanish border waited. Somewhere beyond that, Portugal, London, the chance to rest, the chance to heal. But first, the ridge. First, the ice. First, the next step. She took it. Virginia Hall had never intended to become a spy. In another life, in another history, she might have become a diplomat. That had been the original plan, formed in the comfortable years before everything changed. She was born in Baltimore in 1906, to a family of means and ambition. She attended Radcliffe and Barnard. She studied in Paris, Vienna, Strasbourg. She spoke French like a native, German with precision, Italian with warmth. She collected languages the way other women collected gloves. The State Department should have wanted her. They did not. The Foreign Service examination had gone well. Her qualifications exceeded those of most candidates. But the interviews revealed something the paperwork could not capture. She was too direct, too unconventional, too female. The rejection letters accumulated through the 1930s, each one polite, each one final. Then came Turkey. She was working as a clerical assistant at the American consulate in Smyrna when the accident happened. A hunting trip, a shotgun, a moment of carelessness that lasted less than a second and echoed for the rest of her life. The blast took most of her left leg below the knee. Gangrene nearly took the rest. By the time the surgeons finished, she was left with a stump, a prosthetic, and the absolute certainty that the diplomatic career she had fought for would never happen. The State Department had rules about such things. Foreign Service officers were required to be physically whole. The loss of a limb was disqualifying. It did not matter that she could still think, still speak, still analyze. The rules did not accommodate women who walked differently. So she walked away from the rules. When war came to Europe in 1939, she was in Paris, still working minor consular positions, still watching the world burn from the edges. When France fell in 1940, she was among the thousands who fled south, away from the German advance, toward the unoccupied zone that Vichy France maintained under the fiction of neutrality. Most refugees wanted only to escape. Virginia Hall wanted to go back. The British found her in Spain. Or perhaps she found them. The sequence of contact remains unclear in the surviving records. What is known is that by the spring of 1941 she had made her way to London, and London had decided she might be useful. The Special Operations Executive was barely a year old. Its mandate, delivered directly from Churchill, was simple and savage. Set Europe ablaze. The organization needed agents who could operate behind enemy lines, building networks of resistance, coordinating sabotage, gathering intelligence. They needed people who spoke the languages, knew the terrain, understood the cultures. They needed people who could disappear. Virginia Hall could disappear. Her limp was a problem. Every instructor noted it during training. Every assessment flagged the risk. An agent behind enemy lines needed to blend into crowds, to move without attracting attention, to become forgettable. A woman who walked with a distinctive gait was none of these things, but she had something the others did not. She had lived in France. She had worked there. She had contacts, connections, a cover story that did not require fabrication. She could enter the country as something close to what she actually was, an American journalist, a neutral observer, a woman with legitimate reasons to be asking questions. In August of 1941, she crossed into Vichy France and began to build. The work was slow, it was invisible, it was extraordinarily dangerous. Her official role for the Special Operations Executive was deceptively simple. She was a liaison, a recruiter, a coordinator. She identified potential resistance members. She assessed their reliability. She connected them with London's resources, money, weapons, training, communication equipment. She helped establish escape lines for downed Allied airmen and agents, whose covers had been blown. None of this appeared in any official record that the Vichy authorities might examine. On paper, she remained Virginia Hall, correspondent for the New York Post, a neutral American asking questions about life under occupation for readers back home. The cover held. For months it held. But covers were fragile things. They depended on documents that might be forged, on stories that might not survive interrogation, on the assumption that no one was looking too closely. By the autumn of 1942, someone was looking very closely indeed. The Gestapo had begun to notice patterns. Resistance activity in the Lion region had increased. Escape lines were functioning with unusual efficiency. Sabotage operations showed a level of coordination that suggested central guidance. Somewhere in the network, there was an organizer. They did not know her name yet, but they knew her description. A woman, American, a limp, the Limping Lady. If this history matters to you, like and subscribe so these stories aren't lost. Lion, in the autumn of 1942, was a city of layers. On the surface, it functioned. Shops opened, trams ran, restaurants served meals, though the portions had grown smaller and the prices higher with each passing month of occupation. The streets filled during daylight hours with workers, housewives, children walking to school. A visitor might have mistaken it for an ordinary city enduring an ordinary hardship. Beneath the surface, the layers multiplied. The Vichy police maintained order in their blue uniforms, enforcing French laws that had been rewritten to serve German interests. They checked papers at random. They noted faces. They filed reports on anyone whose behavior deviated from acceptable patterns. They were French, which made them more dangerous than Germans in some ways. They knew the neighborhoods. They understood the accents. They could spot an outsider by the way she pronounced a street name or hesitated before a familiar landmark. Above the Vichy police, like a shadow government, operated the German security services. The Abwehr handled military intelligence. The Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, managed political threats. And the Gestapo enforced order through methods that required no laws at all. They had offices in Lion. They had informants. They had interrogation facilities where questions were asked and answered in rooms that no one discussed afterward. Virginia Hall moved through these layers like water through cracks. The routine was everything. A spy's survival depended not on cleverness, but on consistency. She rose at the same hour each morning. She took the same routes to the same cafes. She met the same contacts at intervals that would appear, to any observer, entirely social. An old friend for coffee, a colleague for lunch, a chance encounter in a bookshop. None of it was chance. Every meeting was scheduled days in advance through coded messages passed through intermediaries. Every contact was vetted through a process that took weeks, sometimes months. Every word spoken in public was chosen for the ears that might be listening, and the true information was exchanged in the silences between words. The geography of Lion became her instrument. The city sat at the confluence of two rivers, the Rhône and the Saône. The old town, with its traboules, covered passageways that connected buildings and cut through blocks, offered routes invisible from the main streets. A woman walking into a courtyard might emerge 3 buildings away, having passed through cellars and stairwells that appeared on no official map. She learned the traboules. She learned which concierges could be trusted and which reported to the police. She learned which cafes were frequented by German officers and which were avoided by anyone with secrets. She learned the schedules of the trams, the patterns of the patrols, the hours when streets emptied and movement became conspicuous. The limp was both weakness and weapon. Every step she took was audible. The prosthetic struck the cobblestones with a rhythm that announced her presence. In a crowd, this was manageable. The sounds blended, but on a quiet street, at an hour when she should not have been walking, the cadence of her gait was a signature that could not be erased. So she avoided quiet streets. She avoided wrong hours. She built her movements around the city's own rhythms, appearing only when others appeared, vanishing when they vanished. The cost was constant vigilance. She could never walk without calculation. She could never enter a building without noting the exits. She could never meet a contact without observing first, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, to ensure the location had not been compromised. And still the system pressed in. Papers were checked with increasing frequency. The Vichy authorities had grown nervous as the war shifted. The German advance into Russia had stalled. Allied forces had landed in North Africa. The fiction of neutrality was wearing thin, and the response was predictable. More patrols, more inspections, more pressure on anyone who did not fit the expected patterns. Her documents were good. The Special Operations Executive had forgers who produced work that could survive most examinations. But documents were only as strong as the stories behind them. A suspicious officer might accept the papers while noting the face. A helpful collaborator might mention the American woman to someone who would mention her to someone else. Information moved through the occupation like infection through a wound. By October, the infection had reached critical levels. Agents she had worked with began to disappear. A courier failed to arrive at a scheduled rendezvous. A radio operator went silent. A safe house that had sheltered dozens was raided, its occupants taken to Montluc prison, where interrogations followed processes that could not be survived without speaking. Every disappearance was a thread that might lead back to her. The Germans did not need to capture her directly. They only needed to capture someone who knew her face, her routine, her cover name. Under sufficient pressure, anyone might speak. The question was only when and how much, and whether she would have time to move before the information reached the right ears. She had been in France for over a year. The networks she had built were producing results. Escape lines were functioning. Resistance cells were coordinating. Intelligence was flowing to London through channels she had established. But the success was also her exposure. The more the networks achieved, the more the Germans hunted for their center. And the center was a woman who walked with a limp she could not hide. Movement was never safe. It was only necessary. The first rule of operating behind enemy lines was that every journey increased risk. A stationary agent could control her environment. She could learn its rhythms, predict its dangers, prepare for its inspections. But a moving agent was exposed. She was visible. She was subject to the random encounters that no preparation could anticipate. Virginia Hall moved constantly. The work demanded it. Her agents were scattered across the Lion region and beyond. Radio operators in farmhouses, couriers in villages, organizers in towns she could reach only by train or bicycle. Visiting them meant crossing checkpoints. It meant presenting papers to officials who might remember a previous crossing. It meant walking through stations where Vichy police and German soldiers watched the crowds with professional suspicion. She developed systems. The trains were most dangerous during boarding and departure, when passengers funneled through narrow points of control. She learned to arrive early, to study the platforms, to identify which inspectors were thorough and which were going through motions. She learned which cars attracted less attention. Third class, where working people traveled, where a plain woman with worn shoes would blend rather than stand out. The limp required management. On trains, she could sit. The prosthetic was invisible beneath her skirt, but boarding and disembarking required walking, and walking meant the rhythm that marked her. She took to moving with crowds, matching her pace to others, letting the sound of many footsteps disguise the sound of one. In the countryside, the dangers shifted. Fewer checkpoints, but less cover. A woman walking alone on a rural road attracted notice. Farmers watched from fields. Children pointed from doorways. Every observation was a potential report, and every report might reach someone compiling a list of unusual visitors. She traveled by night when possible. The bicycle was silent, the roads empty, the darkness a temporary ally. But darkness brought its own costs. The roads were poorly maintained. Ruts and stones appeared without warning. Falls were common. A fall, for her, was not what it was for others. When the prosthetic struck an obstacle at speed, the shock traveled directly into damaged tissue. When she went down, she could not catch herself with equal force on both legs. The imbalance meant harder landings, longer recoveries, injuries that accumulated rather than healed. She fell twice in the first month of operations. By the 6th month, the count had reached a number she no longer tracked. The stump bore a map of old bruises layered over new ones. The socket of the prosthetic, despite her best efforts to pad and adjust it, rubbed raw spots that never quite closed before the next journey reopened them. She carried supplies when she could: clean cloth for dressing, alcohol for disinfecting, aspirin for the pain that built through long days and released only in the brief hours of sleep. But supplies were limited and priorities were clear. The aspirin that might ease her discomfort could also save an agent with fever. The cloth that might protect her stump could also bind a wound on someone whose injury was fresh rather than chronic. She made the calculations. She absorbed the costs. The autumn of 1942 demanded more movement than any previous season. The networks were growing. The need for coordination was increasing. And the German occupation of the southern zone, which came in November, changed every calculation she had made. Before November, Vichy France had maintained its fiction of autonomy. German soldiers were present, but their presence was theoretically limited. The Vichy police handled most internal security. The borders between zones were porous, crossable with the right documents and sufficient caution. After November, the fiction ended. German forces flooded into the south. The Vichy authorities, always cooperative, became openly subordinate. The checkpoints multiplied. The patrols intensified. The margin for error that had allowed her to operate for 18 months began to compress toward nothing. She received the warning through channels that had become unreliable. London could not reach all its agents. Radio operators were going silent. Couriers were being intercepted. The message that reached her was fragmentary, passed through intermediaries whose trustworthiness could not be verified. The Gestapo knew about the Limping Lady. They were allocating resources to find her. Every day she remained in France increased the probability that someone would recognize her, report her, or betray her under interrogation. The instruction from London was clear. Extract, get out. The networks could be rebuilt. She could not. But extraction was not simple. The escape routes she had helped establish were designed for others: downed airmen, burned agents, refugees with urgent need. Using them for herself meant trusting people who knew her face, traveling through checkpoints that might have her description, moving across terrain that punished every weakness she had. The Pyrenees waited to the south. Spain waited beyond them. Safety waited beyond that. First, she had to reach the mountains. First, she had to move through a country that was hunting her. First, she had to walk. The radio operator in Toulouse went silent on the 4th of November. She did not know this immediately. Communication in occupied territory moved through layers of indirection, each layer adding delay. The operator's failure to transmit was noted by London. London's concern was relayed through a backup channel to a courier in Perpignan. The courier passed word to a contact in Lyon who waited 3 days for a safe opportunity to deliver it. By the time Virginia Hall received the message, a week had passed. A week in which the operator might have been arrested, interrogated, broken. A week in which anything he knew, and he knew a great deal, might have been extracted through methods that left no room for resistance. She reviewed what the operator knew: names, locations, drop points, safe houses, the architecture of a network she had spent 18 months constructing. He knew her. Not her real name, perhaps. Operational security demanded compartmentalization, but he knew her face. He knew her cover. He knew the distinctive feature that made her memorable to anyone who had seen her once: the limp. If he had talked, and the methods available to the Gestapo suggested he had, then her description was now circulating with a precision that her previous notoriety had lacked. Not just a limping woman, an American, a journalist cover, locations she frequented, contacts she had met. She ran the calculations that no training could fully prepare anyone to run. What did he know? What would they ask? What would he say? The variables multiplied until certainty became impossible. The only reliable conclusion was that staying had become more dangerous than leaving. She began to dismantle. The process was methodical, even as the urgency pressed. Safe houses had to be warned, contacts had to be notified, documents had to be destroyed. The paper trail of 18 months, the coded notes, the schedules, the lists that should never have been written but somehow always were, had to be reduced to ash before German hands could find it. She burned what she could. The rest she scattered, fragmenting the information so that any single piece would be meaningless without the others. It was not perfect. Nothing about extraction was ever perfect. But it was the best that time allowed. The escape route south was partially intact. Partially. The war had a way of degrading certainty. A safe house that had sheltered 20 might have been compromised that morning. A guide who had led successful crossings might have been arrested the night before. Information aged in hours, and she was working with information that was already days old. She reached the first waypoint by train, presenting papers that survived inspection by a margin she could not measure. The Vichy officer had looked at her photograph, looked at her face, looked at her leg, visible now as she stood before him, and handed the documents back without comment. Whether this was indifference or something worse, she could not know. She only knew that she was through, and that the next checkpoint might be different. The second waypoint was a farmhouse outside Perpignan. The farmer was part of the network. His wife had sheltered agents before. They would provide food, rest, information about the crossing. She arrived to find the house empty. Not empty as in unoccupied. Empty as in abandoned. The door hung open. Furniture had been overturned. The smell of a cooking fire lingered. But the fire itself was cold. Whatever had happened here had happened recently, within days, perhaps hours. She did not enter. The training was clear on this point. A compromised location was a trap until proven otherwise. The Germans sometimes waited inside abandoned safe houses, patient, allowing the network to deliver itself. She backed away. She found cover in a stand of trees that gave a view of the road. She waited. The hours passed. No one came. No vehicles appeared. The house remained silent, its open door an accusation she could not answer. By nightfall, she understood that the route had broken. The farmer and his wife were gone, arrested, fled, or dead. The next link in the chain was unreachable without them. The guidance she needed for the mountain crossing had vanished with their knowledge. She was alone in a way that training could describe but not prepare anyone to feel. The Pyrenees rose to the south, invisible in the darkness, waiting. The stump was infected by the second day in the mountains. She knew this before she saw it. The heat radiating from the tissue was distinct from the cold that surrounded it. The sensation of pressure had shifted to something sharper, more insistent. When she finally removed the prosthetic in a shepherd's hut abandoned for the winter, the damage was worse than she had allowed herself to imagine. The skin where the socket had rubbed was not merely raw. It was open. The flesh beneath was swollen, the color wrong, the edges of the wound beginning to show the yellow-white that indicated pus forming beneath the surface. Infection had taken hold, and it was progressing. She had no antibiotics. Such things were available in London, in hospitals, in places that might as well have been on another planet. Here, in a stone hut at 6,000 feet, with the wind forcing its way through gaps in the walls, she had only what she had carried: cloth, alcohol, a needle and thread that she had hoped not to need. The alcohol burned when she applied it. The burn was welcome. It meant the tissue was still alive, still capable of response. She cleaned what she could reach, knowing that the real infection was deeper, beyond the alcohol's penetration. She wrapped fresh cloth around the stump, pulled tight enough to provide pressure, but not so tight as to cut circulation. Then she refitted the prosthetic. The socket pressed against damaged tissue with an intimacy that made her breath catch. Every step she had taken in the past 2 days had driven the infection deeper. Every step she would take in the coming days would do the same. There was no alternative. She could not walk without Cuthbert. She could not stay in this hut, waiting for the infection to spread until it took the rest of the leg, then more. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Move and risk the leg. Stay and lose everything. She moved. The guide who had led the group into the mountains was somewhere ahead. He had not abandoned her deliberately. The pace had simply exceeded what her body could maintain. The other members of the group, men whose legs worked as legs should work, had kept up. She had fallen behind, and the guide had made the calculation that many guides made. The group's survival depended on speed. Waiting for the slowest member endangered everyone. She did not blame him. She would have made the same calculation in his position, but understanding did not change her situation. She was alone in the Pyrenees in November, following a trail she had been shown once, briefly, in failing light. The route existed as fragments in her memory, a distinctive rock formation, a ridge that ran east-west, a stream crossing that marked the halfway point. Whether these fragments would be enough to reach Spain, she could not know. The cold was constant. Her clothing was inadequate, layers chosen for concealment rather than warmth, appropriate for the streets of Lyon but punishing in the mountains. The wind found every gap, every seam, every place where fabric had worn thin from months of hard use. She could not feel her fingers by mid-morning. By afternoon, her face had gone numb except for the parts that burned. She rationed movement as carefully as food. Rest meant cooling. Cooling meant the cold penetrating deeper. But movement without rest meant exhaustion, and exhaustion in the mountains meant death as surely as any bullet. The balance was impossible to strike perfectly. She rested when she had to, in the lee of rocks that blocked the wind, for minutes that stretched toward danger. She moved when rest became its own threat, forcing the infected leg forward, feeling each step as a negotiation between what her body demanded and what survival required. Hunger joined the inventory of pressures. She had carried food for 3 days, assuming the crossing would match the guide's optimistic estimate. The food was gone by the end of the 2nd day. The 3rd day began with empty pockets and a body that had been burning reserves since long before the mountains. The mathematics shifted again. Infection, cold, exhaustion, hunger, each element weakened the other's resistance. Each element accelerated the other's progression. She was not facing a single threat, but a system of threats, interconnected, mutually reinforcing. She climbed anyway. The trail disappeared in places where snow had drifted or wind had erased the marks left by previous travelers. She guessed at the route, using the fragments she remembered, using the shape of the terrain, using instincts that she could not have articulated, but that had kept her alive through 18 months of occupation. Sometimes the guesses were wrong. A ridge that seemed to lead south curved east, and deposited her in a valley she did not recognize. A stream crossing that should have appeared after 2 hours did not appear after 4. Each error cost time, and time in the mountains cost everything else. By the 4th day, the infection had spread. The patrol appeared at the edge of the tree line. She saw them before they saw her, 4 figures moving in formation along a ridge that she had been approaching for the past hour. German border guards. Spanish territory lay somewhere beyond that ridge, but the patrol was on this side of it, and their presence meant the border was close enough to defend. She dropped. The movement was instinctive, the product of months of training and more months of application. Her body hit the snow before her mind had fully processed what she was seeing. The impact drove the prosthetic into her infected stump, and the pain was a white flash that she absorbed without sound. Sound was death now. She lay in the snow, face down, breathing into the fabric of her coat to prevent her breath from rising as visible vapor. The cold seeped into her from below. The wind cut into her from above. The patrol moved along the ridge, and she could not see them anymore, could only imagine their progress by the time elapsed. They would have dogs if they were serious about finding people. Dogs could track through snow, could follow the scent she had been leaving since she entered the mountains. If they had dogs, she was already dead. The only question was how long it would take the animals to reach her. She listened for barking. She heard only wind. Minutes passed. The cold became pain, became numbness, became something beyond sensation. She could not feel the snow against her face anymore. She could not feel her fingers where they pressed into the ground. The only feeling that remained was the pulse in her stump, hot and wrong, the infection announcing itself even as the rest of her body surrendered to the cold. She counted. 100 seconds, 200, 300. The patrol should have moved on by now, should have passed beyond the ridge, should have created a window for her to move. But should was not certainty, and moving too early meant exposure. 400 seconds. She lifted her head. The ridge was empty. The patrol had gone, continuing their sweep along whatever route their orders prescribed. The window existed. It would not exist for long. Rising was harder than falling. Her muscles had stiffened in the cold. Her joints had locked into positions they did not want to leave. The prosthetic had frozen into the snow, and pulling it free required effort that she could barely summon. She stood. She swayed. She did not fall. The ridge was perhaps 500 meters away. 500 meters of open ground, covered in snow that would record every step she took. If another patrol came, they would see her tracks. They would follow them. They would find her, she calculated. Stay and wait for darkness, risking the cold that was already claiming her fingers. Move and risk exposure, trusting that no patrol would appear in the time required to cross. Neither option was good. Survival behind enemy lines was rarely about good options. It was about choosing the least bad option and accepting the consequences. She moved. The snow was knee-deep in places. Each step required lifting the prosthetic high enough to clear the surface, then planting it firmly enough to support her weight, then transferring that weight while maintaining balance on ground she could not see beneath the white. The process was exhausting under normal conditions. Under current conditions, infected, starving, frozen, it was an act of will that had to be repeated 500 times. She did not count the steps. Counting would have broken her. She focused only on the next step, then the next, then the next. The ridge grew closer in increments too small to register until suddenly it was there, and she was climbing its final slope, and the open ground was behind her. She crested the ridge. The far side dropped into a valley she did not recognize. More mountains rose beyond it. Spain was somewhere in that direction, but somewhere was not close enough to mean safety. And there, at the valley floor movement, more soldiers, different uniforms, Spanish border guards, patrolling their side of the line. She had crossed into Spain. She had not crossed into safety. The Spanish were officially neutral. Officially, they did not return refugees to German-controlled territory. But the officials and the reality rarely matched. Franco's regime was sympathetic to the Axis. Unauthorized border crossers were routinely detained, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for longer. A woman with no papers, no explanation, and an infected leg might face questions that had no safe answers. She could not let them see her. Not yet. Not like this. She retreated below the ridgeline, out of sight of the valley, back into the wind that had been trying to kill her for days. She needed to find another route down. She needed to avoid the patrols. She needed to reach someone who could help her. A British contact in Barcelona, a safe house in the network, anything that would transform her from a border crosser into someone with protection. But first, she needed to survive the night. The hut she found was barely a hut. 4 walls of stacked stone, a roof of rotted timber, no door, no fire, no shelter from anything but the wind. She crawled inside and pressed herself into the corner farthest from the opening. Her stump throbbed with each heartbeat. Her body shook with cold. She could no longer distinguish from exhaustion. Sleep was dangerous. Sleep in these conditions could become death without transition. She slept anyway. She woke to daylight and the knowledge that something had changed. The stump. She could feel it differently now. The throbbing had localized, concentrated into a point that radiated outward. The infection had found a center, had begun to form something that her limited medical knowledge could identify as an abscess. If it burst inward, the infection would spread to her bloodstream. If it burst outward, she might be able to drain it, might be able to buy herself time. Neither outcome was within her control. She examined the situation with the clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces. The prosthetic could not be worn in its current state. The socket pressed directly against the abscess, and every step would risk driving the infection deeper. But without the prosthetic, she could not walk. Without walking, she could not reach help. The circle closed on itself. She modified. The cloth she had been using for bandaging was nearly exhausted, but nearly was not entirely. She layered what remained around the abscess, creating a barrier between damaged tissue and socket. The fit was wrong. The additional material threw off the alignment that had taken months to perfect, but wrong was better than impossible. She stood. She tested the weight. The pain was extraordinary, but the leg held. The Spanish valley below her was still dangerous, but the patrol patterns she had observed suggested windows. Early morning and late evening saw the most activity. Midday was quieter, the soldiers retreating to their posts, the terrain left to anyone willing to cross it. She waited for midday. The descent was worse than the ascent. Downhill walking demanded different mechanics, and the modified prosthetic did not accommodate them. Each step jarred the injury. Each jar sent signals that her nervous system interpreted as commands to stop, to rest, to protect the damage from further damage. She ignored the signals. She had been ignoring such signals since Turkey. The valley floor was farmland, dormant for winter but clearly cultivated. Stone walls divided fields. A road ran along the valley's length, leading toward something. A village, perhaps, or at least a crossroads. She avoided the road, keeping to the walls, moving from cover to cover with the patience that occupied territory had taught her. A farmer saw her. He was distant, a figure in a field, doing something agricultural that she could not identify. He stopped. He watched. She did not wave, did not acknowledge, did not alter her movement. She simply continued, as if her presence were the most natural thing in the world, as if a limping woman crossing frozen farmland in midwinter required no explanation. The farmer watched for a long moment. Then he turned back to his work. She did not know what this meant. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps a report that would reach the border guards within hours. The uncertainty was familiar. It was the texture of life behind enemy lines, the constant negotiation between action and consequence, the inability to know until knowing came too late. She reached the road by late afternoon. A village was visible in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys, the suggestion of walls and roofs that promised shelter. The question was whether the shelter would be safe or a different kind of trap. Her cover story was thin. She was an American journalist. She had been traveling in France. She had become separated from her group during the border crossing. The story contained enough truth to survive casual questioning and enough gaps to collapse under serious inquiry. But casual questioning was all she needed. She needed a place to rest. She needed food. She needed someone who could direct her toward Barcelona, toward the British contacts, who could extract her from Spain before the Spanish authorities decided she was more trouble than neutrality required. The village was small, a church, a handful of houses, a tavern that might serve as inn, post office, and community center in the manner of rural Spanish villages. She entered the tavern. The conversation stopped. Every face turned toward her. A woman, alone, limping, her clothing wrong for the climate, her appearance wrong for a local. She was an anomaly, and anomalies in border villages during wartime drew attention. She asked for food. She asked for a room. She offered to pay, producing currency that she had carried from France, hoping that French francs would be accepted or at least exchanged. The innkeeper studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then conversation resumed. She had bought time, hours, perhaps days. The abscess throbbed against its improvised padding. The fever that accompanied infection was building. She could feel it in the way the room seemed to shift around her, the way thoughts came more slowly than they should. She needed a doctor. She needed antibiotics. She needed someone who could look at her leg and make it function again. She ate what she was given. She climbed to the room she was assigned. She collapsed onto a bed that was hard and narrow and more comfortable than anything she had felt in weeks. The door had no lock. She pushed a chair against it anyway. Then sleep took her, and she did not dream. She remained in the village for 6 days. The fever peaked on the 3rd day. She remembers little of this period, fragments of light through a small window, the face of the innkeeper's wife, bringing broth she could not taste, the sensation of heat that seemed to come from inside her bones. The abscess had not burst. The infection had not spread to her blood. But it had weakened her in ways that the mountains had only begun. Recovery was slow. Slower than she wanted, slower than circumstances allowed. Word traveled in border villages. A stranger had arrived, a woman with an injury. She had money, but no papers. She spoke French like a native, and Spanish like someone who had learned it from books rather than conversation. The details accumulated, passed from mouth to mouth, reaching ears she could not identify. On the 4th day, the innkeeper suggested she should leave soon. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Someone had asked about her. Someone official, perhaps, or someone who reported to officials. The window she had bought with currency and passivity was closing. But she could not walk. Not yet. The stump needed time to heal enough to bear the prosthetic again. The fever needed to break completely before she could trust her judgment in unfamiliar territory. The risk of leaving too early competed with the risk of staying too long. She stayed another day, then another. On the 6th day, she forced herself vertical. The prosthetic fit poorly. The swelling had changed the stump's shape, and the socket that had been modified for the mountains no longer accommodated the new geometry. She padded where she could, adjusted where she could, and accepted that every step would be a negotiation between pain and necessity. The innkeeper provided directions. A road led south toward a larger town. From there, transport to Barcelona might be arranged. He did not ask why she needed to reach Barcelona. He did not ask about her injury or her papers or the circumstances that had brought her to his village in the middle of winter. He simply pointed south and accepted her payment and watched her limp away down the road. The journey took 4 days. She moved slowly now, no longer driven by the immediate fear of German patrols, but by the deeper exhaustion that the mountains had installed in her body. The terrain was gentler. The weather was less hostile, but the accumulated costs of the crossing, the infection, the hunger, the cold, the falls, had reduced her reserves to something that could not be rebuilt by willpower alone. She rested when her body demanded rest. She ate when food was available, purchasing meals in roadside establishments that asked no questions and expected no answers. She slept in barns, in doorways, in any shelter that offered a few hours of unconsciousness. The stump stabilized. The abscess did not grow. The fever did not return. She was not healing, not truly, but she was no longer deteriorating. The stalemate was the best she could hope for. Barcelona appeared on the horizon like something from a dream she had forgotten having. The city was larger than anywhere she had been since Lyon. It moved at a pace that seemed impossibly fast after the stillness of the mountains and the silence of the village. Vehicles filled the streets. People crowded the sidewalks. She was anonymous here in a way that rural Spain had not allowed, and the anonymity was its own kind of relief. The contact was where London had said he would be, a British official working under diplomatic cover, managing the slow machinery of extraction for agents who had made it out of occupied territory. He looked at her, at the limp, at the clothes, at the hollows under her eyes, and asked no questions she could not answer. Papers were arranged, transport was arranged. She would travel to Lisbon, then London. She would receive medical attention. She would rest. The journey from Lyon to Barcelona had taken 3 weeks. She had walked across the Pyrenees in winter on one leg. The official said something about courage. She did not hear the word the way he meant it. Courage suggested choice, and she had made no choices except the ones survival required. She had walked because stopping meant dying. That was not courage. That was arithmetic. London should have been the end. The debriefings lasted weeks. The medical examinations lasted longer. The stump required surgery to address damage the mountains had inflicted. The recovery required months that she spent in hospitals and convalescent facilities, surrounded by nurses who did not know what she had done and physicians who could not imagine where she had been. She told them about Cuthbert. She told them the prosthetic had caused her trouble. They did not understand that the trouble was not mechanical. The trouble was that she had asked too much of a body that had already been asked too much. The trouble was that survival extracted costs that did not end when the immediate danger passed. But London was not the end. The war continued. The networks she had built in France were compromised, but not destroyed. The techniques she had developed, the contacts she had cultivated, the knowledge she had accumulated, all of it remained valuable to organizations that measured value in operational terms. And she wanted to go back. This surprised no one who knew her, and everyone who did not. The reasoning was difficult to articulate. She had nearly died in those mountains. She had walked through pain that most people could not imagine and would not survive. The rational response was to accept extraction as permanent, to find other ways to contribute, to let younger agents with functional bodies take the risks she had already taken. She did not accept the rational response. The Special Operations Executive had reservations. Her limp made her identifiable. Her previous operations had made her known. The Gestapo file on the Limping Lady remained open. Returning to France meant accepting a level of risk that even dedicated agents might refuse. She accepted it. The Office of Strategic Services, the American counterpart to SOE, accepted her. America had entered the war now, and American agencies needed experienced operatives. Her citizenship, which had once been an obstacle to diplomatic service, became an asset to intelligence work. She was one of theirs, and they wanted her. The training was different this time, more intensive, more focused on clandestine operations, more conscious of the specific vulnerabilities that her prosthetic created and the specific methods that might mitigate them. In March of 1944, she parachuted into occupied France. The drop was terrifying. The prosthetic complicated the landing. She could not flex the artificial ankle, could not absorb impact the way training prescribed. She hit the ground hard enough to drive the wind from her lungs and hard enough to know that the stump would bruise again. She rose. She oriented herself by the stars. She moved toward the rendezvous point. France had changed in the 18 months since her crossing. The occupation had hardened. The resistance had grown. The D-Day invasion that would come in June was still months away, but the preparation for it had already begun. Her assignment was to support that preparation, to organize partisan units, to coordinate sabotage, to ensure that when the Allied forces landed, the infrastructure of German occupation would be collapsing from within. The work was familiar. The conditions were not. She operated now under deeper cover than before. Her appearance had been altered, not dramatically, but enough to confuse recognition. She dyed her hair gray. She changed her style of dress. She adopted the persona of an elderly peasant woman, someone beneath notice, someone whose limp could be attributed to age rather than amputation. The disguise was imperfect. Disguises always were, but it bought time. It bought doubt. When German patrols looked at her, they saw what the disguise told them to see, and their eyes moved on. She built networks again. She trained guerrilla units. She coordinated sabotage operations that destroyed bridges, cut communications, delayed German reinforcements. The invasion came in June, and the partisans she had organized were ready, and still the pressure did not relent. The closer the Allies came to victory, the more desperate the German security services became. They had fewer resources now, but they used those resources with increasing ferocity. Agents were captured. Networks were betrayed. The Limping Lady remained on their list, a priority target, someone whose capture would be celebrated and whose information would be extracted by any means available. She evaded. Again and again she evaded. Not through cleverness alone, but through the same arithmetic that had carried her across the Pyrenees. Move or die, hide or die, adapt or die. The stump never healed properly. The mountains had installed damage that no surgery could fully repair. Every step she took in those final months of the war was purchased with pain that she had learned to absorb so completely that she no longer registered it as abnormal. Pain was simply part of how she moved now. Pain was simply part of who she was. The war ended in Europe in May of 1945. Virginia Hall was still in France when it ended. She had survived. The networks she had rebuilt had contributed to liberation. The agents she had trained had carried out missions that historians would later document and celebrate. She was offered recognition, the Distinguished Service Cross, the only woman to receive it during the war. The citation noted her courage, her dedication, her extraordinary service under conditions of extreme danger. She requested that the ceremony be private. The reasons were practical, or so she explained. A public ceremony would compromise her ability to continue working in intelligence. Her face would become known. Her cover would be blown. The quiet service that defined her career would become impossible. But there were other reasons that the practical explanation concealed. She had watched friends die. She had built networks that were betrayed. She had survived when others had not, and survival carried its own weight that ceremonies could not address. The medal was for actions she had taken, but the actions had occurred in a context that no medal could represent. She continued working. The Office of Strategic Services became the Central Intelligence Agency. The clandestine work that war had demanded became the clandestine work that peace demanded. She served in posts she could not discuss, performing operations she could not describe, maintaining the silence that her profession required. The leg continued to deteriorate. The prosthetic technology of the era was limited. The socket that fit her stump in 1945 no longer fit by 1950. The damage from the Pyrenees compounded over time, creating complications that required additional surgeries, additional adjustments, additional accommodations. She adapted. She had always adapted. But adaptation had limits. By the 1960s, her mobility had decreased significantly. The energetic crossings that had defined her wartime service were no longer possible. She could not walk the distances she had once walked. She could not move at the speed she had once moved. The body that had carried her across mountains and through occupied territory was announcing that the debts she had accumulated could not be deferred forever. She retired from the CIA in 1966. The retirement was quiet, like everything else in her career. No public acknowledgement. No official history. The files on her operations remained classified for decades. The woman who had been the most hunted Allied agent in occupied France became, in civilian life, simply an elderly woman with a limp who lived quietly and spoke little about her past. The French knew what she had done. They awarded her the Croix de Guerre. They made her a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur. The citations spoke of bravery and sacrifice and the bonds between allies. She accepted the honors without ceremony. The neighbors who lived near her home in Maryland did not know who she was. They saw an older woman who kept to herself, who walked with difficulty, who seemed to have stories she did not tell. They did not know about Lyon or the Pyrenees or the mountain crossing that had nearly killed her. They did not know about the networks she had built, or the agents she had trained, or the years she had spent being hunted by the most efficient security apparatus the 20th century had produced. She did not tell them. Silence was its own kind of survival. The war had taught her that. The years after the war had confirmed it. The world did not need to know what she had done. The world only needed to have been changed by it. And the world had been changed. The escape lines she had established saved hundreds of Allied personnel. The resistance networks she had organized contributed to the disruption that made D-Day possible. The intelligence she had gathered influenced decisions that shaped the course of the war. The cost of these contributions remained private: the damaged stump, the surgeries, the chronic pain, the memories that surfaced at unexpected moments, the faces of colleagues who had not survived, the weight of decisions made under pressure that could not be unmade. She carried all of it. She had always carried all of it. That was what survival meant. Virginia Hall died on July 8, 1982. She was 76 years old. She had outlived most of the agents she had worked with, most of the contacts she had cultivated, most of the enemies who had hunted her. The world had changed around her in ways that the young woman who had wanted to be a diplomat could not have imagined, and the old woman who had become a spy could not have prevented. Her obituary was brief. The newspapers that noticed her death mentioned her service, but the details remained classified. The full story of what she had done, the extent of her networks, the number of her escapes, the scope of her contribution, would not emerge for years, and even then only in fragments. What remained was the body, the leg that had defined her in the eyes of the Germans, the prosthetic that had failed her in the mountains and carried her anyway, the stump that had never fully healed from the crossing that should have been impossible. She had named the prosthetic Cuthbert. The name was a kind of acknowledgment that the artificial limb was both part of her and separate from her, both ally and adversary in the long negotiation that had defined her survival. She had cursed Cuthbert in the Pyrenees when the socket wore through her skin. She had relied on Cuthbert in the fields of occupied France when movement meant life and stillness meant death. The relationship was complex in ways that people with two legs could not fully understand. A prosthetic was not a replacement for what had been lost. It was a negotiation with loss. Every step required conscious effort. Every surface required assessment. Every day began with the ritual of fitting, the stump into the socket, the straps into position, the adjustment that would determine whether the hours ahead would be manageable or agonizing. She had performed this ritual thousands of times, in hotel rooms in Lyon, in shepherds' huts in the Pyrenees, in safe houses across occupied France, in hospital beds where surgeons explained what they would try to fix and what they could not. The ritual became her. The limitation became her strength. The thing that should have disqualified her from service had become the characteristic that made her service unique. The Limping Lady. The Germans had meant the name as identification, a way to mark her for capture, but the name contained a truth they had not intended. She was defined by her movement, by the way she navigated terrain that others could cross without thought. Every step she took was a declaration that she would not be stopped by what her body lacked, and she had not been stopped. She had built networks under occupation. She had coordinated resistance across hundreds of miles. She had crossed the Pyrenees in winter when the cold and the ice and the infection should have ended her. She had returned to occupied territory when returning seemed impossible. She had survived when survival itself seemed unreasonable. The costs of this survival did not appear in any official record. The scars on her stump, the nights when pain made sleep impossible, the moments when memory surfaced without warning, bringing faces and voices from decades ago into the present with an immediacy that no distance could diminish. She had paid these costs quietly. She had absorbed them the way she had absorbed everything else, as facts of existence, as elements of a life that had been shaped by circumstances she had not chosen and decisions she had made anyway. This was not heroism. This was endurance. The difference mattered. Heroism implied a moment of decision, a choice to rise above ordinary limits. But she had not risen above limits. She had lived within them, adapting constantly, recalculating constantly, accepting that each day would bring new pressures and each pressure would require new responses. The Pyrenees were not a choice. They were an arithmetic problem. Stay and die, or move and possibly live. She had chosen possibly live, and the choice had cost her in ways that she was still paying when she died 4 decades later. The war had ended, but the war's residue remained in her body, in her memory, in the shape of her life. This was what survival meant. Not victory, not triumph, not the clean ending that stories prefer. Survival meant living with the consequences of having survived. Survival meant carrying what could not be set down. Survival meant Cuthbert, and the stump, and the pain, and the memories, and the silence that covered all of it like snow covering tracks in the mountains, concealing but not erasing, hiding but not removing. She had walked across the Pyrenees on one leg in winter. She had kept walking for 40 years after that. She had stopped only when there was nowhere left to walk. And the walk, the limping, stubborn, painful walk, was everything she had been.